How do you respond to people who say that Paul corrupted Christianity?
Right, so this is a common charge levied against Christianity. If you're going to claim that what Christians currently believe, say about the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the incarnation, then you're going to have to find somebody, stake out somebody to place the blame upon. Some people will defer this to something like the Council of Nicaea, or the Council of Constantinople, or the Council of Chalcedon. But very often people will say that it was Paul who came up with these things. In any case, it's not found in the apostolic writings. But when it comes to saying Paul made up these things, the question I like to ask people at this point is simply, what in particular do you think Paul taught that wasn't taught by Jesus or his hand-picked disciples? And if they come back and say something like the deity of Christ, Paul taught this, the other apostles didn't, first I say, okay, good, you're acknowledging that Paul taught it, so I don't have to labor on that front, but you have something, just by going this far, you have something you have to deal with. Here is a Jew in the first century who is boldly proclaiming in Jesus the coming of God, that God has come in the flesh. And he's proclaiming this to other Jews as well as to Gentiles, and he's doing so imperiling his own life. This is remarkable and not something that's easily brushed aside. How do you account for this individual who was staunchly Jewish? He was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, proclaiming this, proclaiming it to Jews, and doing so when his own life is jeopardized in the process. He's certainly not winning anybody's favor, not the favor of anybody who's going to treat him well. The Jews were running around the empire following Paul, stirring up trouble for him, trying to bring him under the eye of the civil authorities so that they might bring consequences upon him. But then I simply turn to the other writings of the apostles and show how they just as certainly affirm the deity of Christ as Paul did. It wasn't Paul who said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That was said by the Apostle John. It wasn't Paul who said, "Upon seeing the risen Christ, my Lord and my God." That was the Apostle Thomas. It wasn't Paul who said, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord." That was written by Mark. Notice that Mark cites the prophet Isaiah saying this, that the one who's coming is the Lord, and he's citing this as explanatory of the designation Son of God, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. So the prophetic statement is explanatory of that declaration of Christ's sonship. So it's a divine sonship. It indicates that he is nothing less than the Lord, whose way was prepared. But don't miss in all of this that he's pointing back to an earlier prophet. It's not just the apostles who are saying that the coming one is deity. The prophet Isaiah said this. He says this many times over in his writings. And he's not the only prophet. Jeremiah 23, verse 5, declares that the coming one is the Lord our righteousness, Yahweh our righteousness, Yahweh Sidkenu. So the apostles and the prophets before them, all before Paul, are proclaiming this great truth. So if you're going to claim that Paul innovated, you can't claim it here. You're going to have to find something else to blame on Paul. If the person comes back and says Paul innovated the idea of being justified by faith, well, Note, for one, how Paul argues for justification by faith. Paul points back to Genesis 15, the example of Abraham. In Genesis 15, God made a promise to Abraham and said he would bless him, he would multiply his seed, and so forth. And ultimately, when you cash out all that God is promising to Abraham with respect to his future seed, he's telling Abraham that there's going to come someone from his line who will ultimately reclaim the nations. This one will ultimately bring about the salvation that the human race so desperately needs. We're told that Abraham believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness, Genesis 15:6. Paul cites this in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 when he's arguing that we're justified by faith, that is, that we are accounted by God as righteous. Righteousness is imputed to us through faith. So this doctrine, far from being an innovation, is found in the earliest of the biblical record, or the biblical writings. Moses said this. And it's not only Moses, it's not only Paul. I just quoted Jeremiah 23, where it mentions that the coming one will be our righteousness, the Lord our righteousness. Isaiah 53 says, by the knowledge of him, he will justify the many, or the many will be accounted righteous. That's the literal upshot of the Hebrew. It's the hiphil form, which means it's causative. He will cause them to be righteous. He'll justify them. So this isn't a doctrine that Paul made up. This isn't something unique to Paul. And even in the apostolic writings, we see this same thing. Luke tells the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. And in that parable, you have a man who expects to be accepted by God on the basis of his own doings, his own works. And yet we're told that this publican didn't even dare look up to heaven, but beat his breasts, and he cried out for mercy. Jesus said that man went home justified. So this is not justification by works, it's justification by trusting in divine mercy. That man is justified who trusts in the Lord. So all you have to do when somebody says that Paul is the one who is responsible for the things that Christians believe today, the things that they find so distasteful, so odious, all you have to do is ask, well, what did Paul come up with that isn't found in earlier revelation? And you have to know your Bible. You have to know how to respond to this and show that it's not isolated in the writings of Paul. It's found throughout the biblical record.